Ladies, we need to talk about Tempdrop. Tempdrop gives you everything you need to effortlessly track your fertility. Wear the Tempdrop sensor while you sleep for accurate temperature readings without the stress of early morning wake-ups. Tempdrop's accompanying app enables you to chart an array of symptoms alongside your temperature, including cervical mucus and OPKs. Combine these fertility signs all in one place to identify your fertile window and confirm ovulation. Whether you're trying to conceive, avoiding pregnancy, or want to chart for health reasons, Tempdrop makes fertility awareness accessible to all women, even if you don't have regular cycles or sleeping patterns. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/Tempdrop and use coupon code FertilityFriday at checkout for 10% off your order. That's fertilityfriday.com/Tempdrop. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 373. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today. So today I am introducing a brand new series. Since this is the 7th year of the podcast, and there are a number of podcast episodes that I refer to on a regular basis, especially for the newer listeners to the show, there's a lot of content to be going through. And so coming off the heels of last week's episode that was really focused on IVF and IUI and artificial reproductive technology, this is an episode that I actually alluded to in the previous episode. Today's episode is all about Clomid, IUI, femara. So basically, IUI is intrauterine insemination, and Clomid and femara are some of the common drugs that are used in the process. I think Clomid may be used a little bit less frequently now, but certainly it's still used. And so this data is basically essentially the data that I presented in the Fifth Vital Sign in Chapter 17, which is planning for pregnancy. And so it's going through what the research tells us about what these drugs are, how they impact ovulation, how efficient they are in stimulating ovulation, and also what are the success rates. So breaking down the pregnancy rate compared to the live birth rate, and what does the research tell us in terms of the efficacy based on age. So are these procedures equally effective regardless of whether you're 20 years old or 38, or does the efficacy change with age, and if so, how much? And so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. And today I wanted to share with you some of the research that I've done in this area, and just to give you a sense of what Clomid, which is, for those of you who may not be familiar with Clomid, Clomid is a drug that basically forces you to ovulate. So many of my clients have experienced the situation where they come off of hormonal contraceptives and they're wanting to start a family, start trying to conceive, but their period doesn't come back right away. So we've talked about that a lot on the podcasts. It's pretty common. It's not necessarily a problem for the first couple of months because it is common, and you can expect that for some women, it can take a couple of months before you actually get your first real period after coming off of hormonal contraceptives. However, if that persists and it continues past the 4-month mark, past the 6-month mark, and, past the 12-month mark, I've had a number of episodes where I've actually spoken to women who experienced hypothalamic amenorrhea post-pill that went on for years. So although that's not very common, it can happen. And so what happens in those situations is, you go to your doctor and you say, hey, I went off the pill 6 months ago. I haven't got my period yet. So of course, doctor rides in on a white horse and says, well, we can fix that. Let's give you this drug to make you ovulate. And then that is typically done within an IUI cycle, so intrauterine insemination. So the whole purpose of that procedure is essentially to bypass whatever is happening naturally in your body, force ovulation, and then bypass your mucus, bypass everything, and actually put the sperm directly into your uterus. And so I just want to talk today about what some of the research says around this procedure, the effectiveness of it, and some of the effects that it can have on your body. And I think it's an important place to start. Of course, I want to say that, I'm not trying to say that there's no place for artificial reproductive technologies, because there is. And ultimately, there are women who do use these drugs and have the success that they're looking for. They actually ovulate and then conceive and carry the pregnancy to term. And so what I want to do in this episode is just talk to you a little bit about what the success rate really looks like, so that we can have an honest conversation about what the statistics show around the chances that these methods will succeed. I've done a number of episodes on IVF, and when I've interviewed guests to talk about IVF, for instance, in my interview with Dr. Marjorie Dixon, she went through and provided a really good understanding of what the success rates are. And one of the things that I remember from that interview, and I know a lot of my clients have, said it to me too, because that's something that stood out for them in that interview, is that Dr. Dixon described IVF to be happening in cycles of 3. And so when she's talking to her patients about it, she's explaining to them that what we're looking for is the success rate out of 3 attempts at IVF. So it's important to know what the success rates are. And so since I've never met anybody who has shelled out the money to do an artificial reproductive technology, so whether that is IUI or IVF or, some sort of version of artificial reproductive technology, I've never met anybody who has invested the money into that to really think it's not going to work. I mean, we all think it's going to work. You have to go into these procedures with some optimism and the belief that they're going to work. And so one of the challenges in my line of work is that I'm not sure if it's being relayed what the actual statistics are. So let's jump right in and talk about that. And so, there's a lot of research that has been done in this area. IVF is a big business, artificial reproductive technologies. There's a lot of money in that. And so as a result, there has been a lot of scientific research around it. And so it doesn't actually take much to look into these things and to actually find some papers that talk about what the success rates are. So there's a few things that you're going to want to pay attention to. So for those of you who are listening who are like me and this is stimulating your inner nerd and you're going to want to go and look into this more yourself, there's a few things that you just want to pay attention to. When you're looking at studies regarding the effectiveness of, say, Clomid, so the medical term is clomiphene citrate, or Letrozole, the drugs that we'll be talking about today, you really want to pay attention to how success rate is defined. Often these studies call pregnancy as a success, and that would make sense, right? I mean, obviously that's the whole point of this thing. However, it's really important to know, as we'll talk about a bit more, that 100% of those pregnancies that result from these drugs do not result in a live birth. So for all of these drugs, just like IVF, just like everything that we're going to be talking about, there is always a percentage of those pregnancies that end in miscarriage. So that's the first thing. I find it very interesting when you're reading studies and they talk about the success rate or the pregnancy rate, but make no mention of the fact that not all of those pregnancies resulted in a live birth. So when we're talking about success rates, ultimately, I have never met a woman who is going through all of these artificial reproductive technologies, who's making all the changes, who's listening to this podcast and actually believes that a pregnancy that results in a miscarriage is a success. Obviously, that's not what we're looking for. So we want to have a realistic idea of what we're looking at when we go into these types of conversations. So obviously, I'll be talking about that and to really get a sense of like, okay, so we have this pregnancy rate, but what is the rate of miscarriage? What is kind of like the net actual live birth rate after these things have been done? And why is it not the same for every woman?
So there's one study that I'm looking at, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes page. And so this study was published in 2013, and it's called Success Rate of Inseminations Depending on Maternal Age. So in this study, basically what they did was they analyzed 4,046 insemination cycles. So they had a total of 1,612 patients that were included in the analysis. And what I appreciate about this study is that they actually broke down the results by age. And the reason that this is important is because just as we've, spoken about in a number of episodes throughout the whole time I've been podcasting, is that our fertility does change with age. That's one of the challenges with not having the knowledge and the education around our menstrual cycles, because it leaves us with the impression that we're fertile, every day, and also that is just how it is. And regardless of whether you're 25 or whether you're 37, it's actually exactly the same. And it's not, it changes. So one of the key points about IUI, Clomid, Letrozole, is that the results and the success rates vary with age. So I'll just go through some of this with you just to kind of give you some numbers to kind of I think the numbers kind of help to make it more concrete. So what they found in this study was that, and I guess one other thing to pay attention to when you're evaluating the studies is that when they're reporting the data, there's a difference between the rate of success per cycle, so per round of IUI, versus the cumulative rate. So often in these studies, so in this study, they did up to 7 cycles. So they would have women do one round of IUI doesn't work, another round of IUI doesn't work, another round. So until hopefully they conceive. And so then you can cite the cumulative effect and say, okay, well, this is the success rate. This is the pregnancy rate. However, again, I've never met a woman who goes into IUI thinking that round isn't going to work. So the cumulative success rate is less helpful in the sense that it can give you a false idea of how likely that particular round is going to succeed. Okay, so they broke it down based on age. So the highest rate of success was for women who were under 25 years of age. So, I mean, that doesn't come as a surprise, but it needs to be said. So in this particular study, 25% of the women who were under 25 years old experienced a pregnancy in their first IUI cycle. So that's kind of the best case scenario. So if you're 21, you have a 25% chance, according to this study, of that first round of IUI resulting in a pregnancy, which is pretty good. I mean, that's 1 out of 4, right? But it's 1 out of 4. So that means 75% of the women who did that one IUI cycle did not get pregnant. So age 25 to 29, that number went down to 14%, 30 to 34, that number went down to 12%, 35 to 39, that number went down to 8%. And then 40 to 41, it was actually 9%. So it was kind of around that 8 to 9% between ages 35 and 41. And age 42 and 43, it was down to 3%. And then over 43, it was 0% in the first cycle. When you're looking at the research, it's really helpful to pay attention to these different factors. So if you want to make the numbers look better, then you can simply add them all together and do the mean and divide, so that you get the average. But it's really helpful to know that your chances of conception with these methods are a lot significantly higher when you're younger. And so it's kind of more helpful to actually consider what the success rate is then for you. So if you're listening to the show and you're, say, between the ages of 30 and 35, then based on this research, for the first round of IUI, you would have had about anywhere from like a 8 to 12% chance of that working the first time. So obviously that means about 90% of the time, roughly, it doesn't work the first time. So I'm sure you can appreciate why I stress this and why I feel like we all need to kind of go into this knowing that. Because what I find is that when women come off of hormonal contraceptives and their cycles don't immediately comply to, of course, what we have come to learn is a normal cycle, so what it's supposed to look like, then there's this idea in the back of your mind that, if my cycles don't, turn into these perfect cycles within X number of months, then I'm going to go straight to artificial reproductive technology. And that is, it's helpful to have that, deadline. It makes you I mean, we all need to live our lives. You have to move forward. But there's this automatic trust and belief that these artificial technologies are going to work. Like they're going to work, and I'm just going to need the one round, and it's going to work. So if you're listening to this episode and you're between the ages of, 30 and 40, the chances of IUI working, based on the results of this particular study, range anywhere between 8 and 12%. The first round. And so, of course, as you go and have more rounds, the rate increases. And so in this study, they actually broke that down by age as well. By the third round, things typically level off. So after the third round of IUI, there's not a whole lot of... So I'm looking at a chart, I'm looking at a graph. And so basically, after about the third round, the graph levels off. There's no more increase. It just kind of stabilizes. So as a general kind of rule. So the cumulative rate for pregnancy broke down in age. So for women who are under 24, after 2 to 3 IUI cycles, the cumulative pregnancy rate stayed at about 37.5%. And 25 to 29, it was about 28%. 30 to 34, it was about 26%. 35 to 39, it was about 22%. 40, 41, it was about 21%. And then 42 and up, the cumulative pregnancy rate was it was 14% for age 42 and 43. And then over 43, it was 8%. So in this study, they did up to 8 insemination cycles. So if it wasn't working, these women went and underwent up to 8 rounds of IUI. And so as you can see, this paints a more specific picture of what the chances are. So having multiple rounds of IUI, after you hit about the third round, there's no more increase. So it's the more rounds you get, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's going to continue to increase your chance of conceiving. So Clomid, the most common drug that is used to stimulate the ovaries and force ovulation, it does have some negative effects. We're going to talk about some of those effects here. And also, what's really interesting is that there's another drug on the market now, Letrozole, that does a very similar thing. But in the research studies that I've read that compare the effectiveness and the application of these two drugs, although they do work similarly, there are some definite differences. And it leaves you with the idea that, Letrozole might be, if you choose to go this route with IUI, there are some indications that maybe Letrozole is more beneficial. So one of the things about Clomid is that Clomid has a longer half-life than Letrozole. So it stays in the body for longer, and it has these hormone disrupting effects. So there's a number of different side effects that are associated with Clomid. So one is the impact that it has on cervical mucus production. Another is the impact that it has on endometrial thickness, so the thickness of your endometrial lining. And then another is just the associated rate of miscarriage. So we're going to talk about all those different things. So what's interesting about Clomid is that there's been a number of studies that have been done that actually analyze the quality of cervical mucus that you have or how it changes after you've gone through a few rounds of Clomid. What they find is that Clomid actually dries up your fertile quality cervical mucus. So the studies that have been done on how Clomid affects cervical mucus have found that after a woman uses Clomid, one or multiple times, her cervical mucus production changes. For those of you who are using fertility awareness or just starting to track your cycles, or who've read Taking Charge of Your Fertility, or who've listened to a bunch of the episodes of the podcast, you'll know that during your fertile window, you produce fertile quality mucus that you can observe. So you can see it. It may have different qualities. So it could range from looking like creamy hand lotion to looking like raw egg whites with that kind of stretchy quality. There's a German word for that stretchy quality called Speinbarkeit. And so that just means that when you are stretching the mucus between your fingers, it has like a thread-like quality. So I always say it's kind of like a spindle or thread, and that's what it's referring to. So women who have used Clomid, like I said, either one or multiple applications of it, what the research shows is that they lose that quality of their mucus. So they end up producing less mucus of that fertile quality, and their mucus ends up being more viscous. And also some of the studies have looked specifically at the sperm's ability to penetrate the mucus, because one of the important reasons that we make mucus to begin with is to allow the sperm to swim through the cervix and to actually make its way through the uterus and the fallopian tubes to fertilize the egg. So it's really critical when you're trying to conceive to have healthy, fertile quality cervical mucus, because without it, the sperm really can't survive in your body. One important side effect to know is that after one or multiple rounds of Clomid, that has been shown to have a negative effect on cervical mucus production, meaning that it changes the mucus quality such that sperm are not able to penetrate and those types of things. If you're charting your cycles, what that could look like is something like what we call dry cycles, meaning that you're checking for mucus every day, but you're not really seeing anything. And because it has a longer half-life, it can actually take a bit more time to get those hormones out your body and actually start seeing that impact reverse. So in many ways, that seems counterintuitive, right? You're taking this drug to make you get pregnant, although it has these negative effects on your cervical mucus production, which again is counterintuitive. One of the other impacts of Clomid on the menstrual cycle is that studies have shown that it also has this effect of thinning the endometrial lining. So because it is interfering with your normal hormone production and because it has a longer half-life, it has these anti-estrogenic effects. And one of the results of those effects is a thinning of the endometrial lining. So for those of you who are wondering, well, how would you be able to tell, how thick the endometrial lining? I know some of you have already had this done, but you can actually have, like a transvaginal ultrasound. And when you're having an ultrasound, your ultrasound tech can actually measure the thickness of your endometrial lining in millimeters. This is an area where the research has been done because it's something that is easy in the sense of the word. It's fairly easy to actually evaluate this. You just have women take Clomid and then measure their uterine lining. And so there is evidence to show that when women are using Clomid, their uterine lining actually thins out. So that's something I spoke about in one of my previous episodes when I was talking about menstruation and what's normal, what does a normal period look like, and to really get at the idea that you can actually get a sense of your hormonal cycle and whether or not your endometrial lining is thick enough by paying attention to your period, because of course your period is a direct result of what happened hormonally in the previous month. And so if your endometrial lining is not developing properly, then that can result in a light period. And so that's something that's hugely important to know, especially because, as we talked about earlier, depending on your age, the first round of Clomid has a very small percentage chance of working. So unless you're 25 years old, we're looking at between, on average, about a 10% chance that you'll get pregnant off that first round of IUI with Clomid. And so that means that you're predisposed, you're more likely to have a few rounds. And the more that you're exposed to these drugs, the more that these effects will kind of rear their ugly little heads. So it's really important to know that these effects are there. So it doesn't mean, don't use Clomid. It doesn't mean that you should never consider it as an option. But it means that when you do consider it as an option, you should know that these are some of the side effects you may experience. And as you can imagine, if you're taking this to try to conceive and then it doesn't happen the first cycle, it doesn't happen the second cycle, then you're left with poor mucus, much lower natural mucus production, and also a thinner endometrial lining. And neither of those things are conducive to fertility, because ultimately you need to have a certain thickness of your endometrial lining to support a pregnancy. That has been shown in research. So if your endometrial lining is less than about 7-8 millimeters in thickness, you're much less likely to conceive and carry a pregnancy. So that's a serious downside, a serious side effect. And also with cervical mucus, if you don't produce enough mucus to keep the sperm alive when you're trying to conceive, then that also, that doesn't help you. That's definitely not what you want. So I've talked about a couple of the specific negative side effects that are associated with Clomid in the literature. And so now I want to take a little bit of time and talk about Clomid versus Letrozole. So I find it really interesting that there are a number of research studies that have been done where essentially they take half of the study participants, give half of them Clomid, half of them Letrozole, and then, measure all the factors to see how it impacts ovarian stimulation, how many follicles are developing, pregnancy rate. They'll measure miscarriage rates. So how many of those pregnancies actually make it to term? And also they'll measure endometrial thickness and things like that. So I think it's interesting to see how these different drugs stack up based on all of these different factors. So for those of you who've never heard of letrozole, what's interesting to me about letrozole is that it's actually a breast cancer drug. Letrozole is an aromatase inhibitor that was approved by the FDA for the treatment of postmenopausal women with breast cancer. And what happened was, they're giving this drug to these women for breast cancer and finding out that it stimulates ovulation. So I always find it really interesting how they didn't develop it for that purpose, but it just so happened that result of triggering ovulation was discovered. And then, of course, it's repurposed for that reason. So just a little bit of trivia in case you're interested. I know that it interests me, so I thought maybe it would interest you as well. So a couple of things. So back to Clomid for just a moment. I think one of the things that's really interesting, so Clomid is kind of presented as the answer to women with PCOS. So polycystic ovary syndrome. So for those of you who've listened to the podcast, I have several episodes about PCOS. If you do want to learn more about PCOS, I've tagged those episodes and put them in one place. So if you go to fertilityfriday.com/PCOS, then you'll see a list of the PCOS episodes there. It's really common for women who are suffering from PCOS not to ovulate regularly and not necessarily to know when their next ovulation's happening or when their next period's coming. It's not uncommon for these women to report that maybe they have like 4 periods a year or 6 periods a year. So in those cases, of course, the doctor is going to suggest a drug that makes you ovulate, because then it actually gives you a chance to try the intrauterine insemination. But according to one study that I was looking at here, only about 20 to 25% of women are actually resistant to Clomid and do not ovulate. It's just really interesting if you think about it. So this drug then is intended to make you ovulate, but they know that anywhere from a fifth to a quarter of the women who they administered this drug to just will not, it literally does nothing for them. Like they don't even ovulate. So there's not even a chance of conception because there's a certain percentage of women for whom it doesn't do anything. And so I went through some of the statistics about the effectiveness. So within that context, I'm sure some of you are like, well, yeah, that makes sense, because if the success rate is so low, then obviously a percentage of those women, it's not making them ovulate. So I think that's really important as well, because again, when we go into these procedures, the assumption is that I'm going to take this drug and it's going to make me ovulate, and therefore it is going to increase my chances of getting pregnant. For some women, it does none of those things. Given the challenges with Clomid, it makes sense that if there's another possibility for a drug that could potentially be more effective or have less of those negative impacts, that'd be good, right? That would be a good thing. And so, enter letrozole. There's been, like I mentioned, a number of studies that have kind of compared their success rates side by side. So in one study that I'm looking at here, it's got a really long name, extended letrozole regimen versus clomiphene citrate for so I'm not going to go the whole thing. I'll just link it in the show notes. But this study was done in 2011. In this study, they had a total of 214 women, and they divided them into 2 groups, as I mentioned. One group got the Clomid and the other group got the letrozole. What the results were, so of course, they're giving us a cumulative pregnancy rate. I've spoken about that, and that's why I spoke about it first, because these success rates don't mean that these women had one round of Clomid and then had this big success rate. It means that over the course of the study, these women had multiple rounds of IUI, and then at the end, they were able to take the total pregnancy for all of those rounds and cite that as the cumulative pregnancy rate. In this study, letrozole outperformed Clomid significantly. So the rate of pregnancy in the letrozole group over the course of the study was 37%, 37.73. The average number of cycles, it says, was 2. So these women underwent a number of IUI to have that cumulative rate of pregnancy. And in this study, they didn't break down for us, as they did in the previous study, how many women got pregnant on the first cycle, how many women got pregnant on the second cycle, third cycle, et cetera, et cetera. Cumulative rate of pregnancy in this study with letrozole was 37.73% versus 22.86% with Clomid. So as you can see right away, the letrozole group had a higher rate of pregnancy. I mean, that's pretty significant. And it's not the only study to show results like that. So when you look at a number of different studies on letrozole versus Clomid, letrozole does seem to come out ahead with regards to pregnancy rate. We have to talk a little bit about the rate of miscarriage, because all of those pregnancies did not end in live births and healthy babies. The letrozole group had a 12.5% rate of miscarriage, where the Clomid group had a 16.67% rate of miscarriage. Some of the studies have shown that Clomid does have a higher rate of miscarriage than, in the studies where they are compared to each other. And possibly, even if they had a similar rate of miscarriage, if letrozole has a higher rate of pregnancy to begin with, then you end up with a higher net live birth rate.
Today's episode is sponsored by Tempdrop. I've had so many conversations with women over the years who've had a hard time staying consistent with their temperatures. So whether you're trying to conceive, avoiding pregnancy, or charting for health reasons, Tempdrop makes fertility awareness accessible to all women, especially if you've recently had a baby and your sleep patterns are all over the place, if you work shift work and it's hard to stay consistent with temping, or if you're otherwise struggling to take your temperatures each day. Identify your fertile window in real time with Tempdrop. Know your cycle, understand your body. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/Tempdrop and use coupon code FertilityFriday at checkout for 10% off your order. That's fertilityfriday.com/Tempdrop. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode.
So the ongoing pregnancy rate, so the pregnancies that actually resulted in a baby at the end, 33% for the letrozole group versus 19% approximately for the Clomid group. So, I mean, this is just information, right? These are real people that we're talking about here. They had to go through, the first round. For many of them, it didn't work. They had to go through the second round. Maybe that didn't work. Third round didn't work. Maybe on the fourth round, they actually conceived. Obviously, a percentage of these women got pregnant on the first round, and some of them conceived and then had miscarriages in the end. So you can see that this is complicated. But overall, what the research that I've read and that I'm sharing with you has indicated is that, between the two, letrozole seems to have a higher rate of pregnancy, a lower rate of miscarriage, some fewer of those negative side effects. Letrozole doesn't have as long of a half-life, whereas Clomid is going to stay in your body a little bit longer and continue to cause these negative effects in your body. Letrozole is going to come out of your body a little bit quicker. By no means does that mean that letrozole has no effects, no negative impacts on your endometrial lining or your cervical mucus. So by no means does it mean that it's like a health thing and it's good for you. It just means that when you compare the two, you can see that there's a difference with respect to the rate of miscarriage, the rate of pregnancy, and also some of these other effects. So for those of you who are listening and really trying to decide what you should do, for those of you who are wondering why your doctor never told you about letrozole, at this point, what I would say is kind of the overarching point is that we want to recognize these fertility treatments for what they are. And they are tools that we can choose to use in certain ways to obviously help you to conceive if you need them. My purpose and reason for sharing this information with you is not to say, never do it, don't do it, because ultimately, there are women who use these treatments successfully, who do go on to conceive and who do, have healthy pregnancies and healthy babies after the process. But we don't want to look at these drugs as panaceas, to look at it as a sure thing. So you don't want to go into this thinking, I know for sure that I'm going to get pregnant on my first try. My doctor's telling me that the rates of success are super high. We want to be critical about the way we're looking at these things. That's the reason why I was sharing with you the difference between the success rate of each individual round of IUI versus the cumulative success rate. So I could easily look at that information and say, well, with letrozole, you have a 37% chance of conceiving. But again, we don't know how many rounds of letrozole it took for each of those women to conceive. So that certainly wasn't accurate to say that that is your chance of it working on the first try, because it's not. And with Clomid, as I outlined in the study that actually broke down how what the chances were kind of on that first try, it gives you a sense that this is really dependent. And I'm sure that some of you listening to that thought, well, I wonder how old those women are in the study. Because if you are younger, the success rate is going to be higher than if you are a little bit older. And that's just how this works. So it's really easy for people to use statistics. I mean, they sound great. I'm using statistics so that I can illustrate and make my points with you and share with you what the research is showing. But at the same time, you don't ever want to look at these statistics outside of the context. You really want to consider all of the different factors that play into it. And I specifically was looking for studies that actually talked about the miscarriage rate. And sometimes when you're looking at these studies, they're not even including that. So there are a number of studies that are showing the success rate of Clomid or Letrozole, but they're showing you the pregnancy rates. They're not telling you how many of those pregnancies resulted in miscarriage. And that's a huge problem, in my opinion, because it's giving you more of an inflated sense of the success of these drugs. Moving forward, as once you're done listening to this episode today, I just want you to think about these things. I want you to really think about, when you're looking at statistics, when you're looking at rates. If you find yourself in a doctor's office, if you have a doctor's appointment coming up, make yourself a list of questions and see if your doctor has the information. Ask. I was wondering what the success rates are. And then when they give you a percentage, say, well, does that change with age? Does that vary? Do I have the same success rate if I'm 25 versus right now I'm 34? Is the success rate going to be different for me? What if I'm 42? Is the success rate different for me at this age than it would have been when I was 21? And really, check into that. Does that success rate, is that just pregnancies, or does that include miscarriage? So does that percentage just tell who got pregnant, or is it actually the women who had babies in the end? Because the live birth rate is very different to the pregnancy rate. And the other thing that is really important to consider when you're thinking about doing artificial reproductive technologies of any kind, or really undergoing any procedure, is that none of these drugs that mess around with your menstrual cycles, so none of the drugs that are going to force your body to ovulate or, do all of these things to force a pregnancy to happen in your body, none of these drugs come without some sort of effect. And so as someone who pays really close attention to menstrual cycles, I work with clients from all over the world and I see their charts. I've seen thousands upon thousands of charts of hundreds of women. And when you look at all those different charts, you can see how travel makes a difference in their cycle, how, having coffee can make a difference in the cycle, being really stressed out at work, having a really positive event happen, like, oh, your niece was just born this week and then you ended up staying at the hospital with your sister for 3 days, and you could see that on your cycle. So just imagine what happens to your cycle when you take a powerful drug that forces you to ovulate. It makes a lot of sense to me that when you're messing with the menstrual cycle, it can have negative effects on cervical mucus. It can have negative effects on endometrial lining. And I have literally seen it in my practice. I've seen the way that these drugs can negatively impact the readings, because when you're paying attention to your mucus and your periods and all of those things, and you're working with me and we're really looking at those things, you can literally see how these drugs negatively impact those parameters and negatively impact your fertility and your ability to get pregnant. So I think it's really important to have that kind of complicated discussion around it, so that we're not just thinking, okay, I'm just going to go get IUI and it's going to work. You really want to think about all those things critically, and at least then it can inform your choices. So maybe instead of going for like 6 rounds, you recognize, okay, well, it didn't work after the 2 or 3 rounds. I know the negative impact that it has on my body, so maybe I'm going to take a break now. Whereas otherwise you would have just continued to go round after round after round, thinking that your chances of it working was, really going to succeed after that. So I hope I've given you lots of food for thought. Like I mentioned, I will list all of the studies that I was referring to on the website, so you can certainly go over there to the show notes page and take a look, for further reading, or if you're interested in learning more about these things.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/373. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I remember when I went through the data for the first time, it was really eye-opening just to learn what the data really shows. And this is a conversation I've had with many of my clients, especially when they're in that kind of late 30s, early 40 range, which is where I myself fall, being 38 years old, which is that when you're looking at some of these procedures, I suppose an episode like this helps you just to kind of have an idea in mind in terms of what questions to ask. And when you get to 40 years old and up, procedures like IUI, the chance of a live birth per cycle are not the same at all as they are with a woman who's like 20, 25. And so they're not free. Of course, they cost money. And some of the drugs have side effects, as we talked about today. Certainly Clomid is kind of well known to have certain negative effects on your natural fertility. And so it doesn't mean, yes, you should or no, you shouldn't. It just means that maybe an episode like this can just let you know about what questions to ask, especially if the information is not necessarily readily provided. If you're being told about pregnancy rates and it's kind of like an overall percentage where all ages are lumped in instead of the percentage based on someone in your particular age range, even something like that is helpful to know, especially so that you can make an informed choice if you feel like it's right for you. And something that I've spoken about with my clients as well is sometimes it can seem like the fertility doctors are really pushy and they want to push you into IVF. It seems like, well, why would I do that? Why would I just go straight to that? But again, depending on your age category, IVF success rates tend to be a lot higher than Clomid, IUI type success rates. And so depending on your age category, that might be why they're doing it. So having some questions, like having a little bit of background knowledge and having some questions prepared to ask can just help you to understand better what would be the best option. And of course, certainly I always talk about having a team approach where you have your medical doctor, you have your fertility specialist, and in many cases, it's also useful to have a functional practitioner, someone who's coming from that kind of holistic perspective, depending on what you want and how you want to address the issue. So with that in mind, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.